The topic of the final session is life stories of Jews in Antwerp and Brussels during the Second World War. And the first speaker in this session is Wolfgang Shellenbacher. He is an historian at the Documentation Center of the Austrian Resistance in Vienna, where he's project leader of the digital archive project Memento Vienna, and he's also working at the Masaryk Institute and Archives of the Czech Academy of Sciences in Prague, and he's currently finishing his PhD on Austrian refugees in Czechoslovakia between 1934 and 1939. Wolfgang, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll try to share my presentation with you. I hope you can see it. Right, thanks. So first of all, thanks for the invitation and thanks for the opportunity to be here, even virtually only. Nevertheless, I tried to give you an insight into some current research, or to be more precise, research that has actually not really been done yet, but I hope to do so in the future. And I'm very happy to do this with both Dorien and Verle being here, because what I'm presenting is a result from a nice small exchange and mapping test that we have done. Talking about mapping transnational data on Austrian refugees in Antwerp, I want to start with Esther Tenzer. Esther Tenzer was born in 1999 in Galicia, of course, at that point part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And like so many other Jews, she had to flee to Vienna with her family in 1914 when the Russian army approached. And her father was a rabbi, and she grew up in Vienna then. In the 1930s, she became part of the communist resistance against the so-called Austro-fascist state. She's very dear to us in the Documentation Center since she worked there after the war as well. But she gave a lot of interviews here, and that is very interesting for us in the past because it gives you an insight into the life in Vienna. For example, she talks about the area where she lived, which is Leopoldstadt, the second district, which had a very high density of Jewish population. However, she talks about the fact that in her living quarters in her area, hardly any Jews lived, which is very puzzling and something that we didn't really know what to do with until we started this project Memento Vienna, which is an online tool optimized for mobile phones and tablets, where we georeferenced the addresses of the victims of the Nazi regime. And the idea was to have a living digital archive with documents where buildings and streets in your vicinity become places of remembrance. What is interesting about this is that it's not a symbolic selection of victims, but it really shows all victims in Vienna. So just walk you through. If you see your own vicinity, then you can click on a building, you see further information, you see all the people who had their last address there and get information on documents, personal photos wherever possible, of course, and of course the information on their fate. So having done a tool for mainly pupils, teachers, and interesting public, something else happened as well. We georeferenced all addresses, so that's more than 50,000 in Vienna. And this can also give you insight into the Nazi policy of the resettlement of Jews at the same time. I will not go into too much detail here, but you can see, for example, very well with this data that obviously in most of the districts of Vienna, the concentration of Jews decreased after the Anschluss. However, in some districts, districts that had already a higher Jewish population, it increased massively, and you can really see this ghettoization that was happening here. That is something that is not unique for Vienna. You have other places like Prague, for example, as well, where this happened at the same time. In fact, this drawing on the right-hand side is from a report of the Jewish community in Prague about the Jewish housing space and how it reduced over time. Doing something like this, you can really see that Tony Weller said this once, that digital history is directly engaged with the role new digital technologies can play in presenting and representing the past, but also in considering new methodologies resulting from them. And it's something that we played with and tried to do, because you can produce these heat maps with this information, heat maps of the last addresses in 1938, and you can really see this density in certain areas already But you can also see that in 1941, this is reduced already to a very small area. And this is this kind of ghettoization that I was talking about here. You can even go in further detail and talk about the addresses in Vienna. And you can see here in yellow then the area that Istatenza was referring to in her area, where you have a lot of addresses, but you look closer, then you see you don't have too many people living there. And you can see this when you compare this with so-called Judenhäuser, these Jewish houses, that there wasn't a single one anymore where she lived beforehand. So it really makes sense now what she was referring to if you look at this on a map like that. In Austria in general, there were 206,000 Austrians who were considered Jewish in 1938, according to the definition set forward in the Nuremberg laws. Most of them, 185,000, living in Vienna. 130 to 135,000 managed to flee. And of course, however, 48,000 were transported from Vienna. But much more were murdered, because not everyone who managed to flee also managed to survive, obviously. And lots of these Austrian Jews were later on transported from Czechoslovakia, Belgium, of course, and other places. Belgium is interesting for us because we have been working on this in the documentation center in the 1980s and not really anymore after that. And looking at Istatenza is really interesting because she's one of these people who managed to flee to Belgium in 1939 together with her mother and her two sisters. She lived in Antwerp, and you can really see when she talks about it, what a big relief that was for her in the beginning, being there. However, later on, her mother and her two sisters, Hanna and Chaya, were deported from Mechelen to Auschwitz in 1943. Istatenza worked in the Jewish communist resistance in Belgium at that time, and she didn't live with the mother and the siblings at that time. However, she was also imprisoned in 1943 and then transported in early 1944. She explains this here, how this happened, that they were not living at the same place, which of course leads to the question, where actually did Austrian refugees live in Antwerp? And that's something that was very nice to see when we had this exchange with Kazerne Dossin, where we mapped their data on people in 1940 in Antwerp, and that's for all the Jews there at that point. However, if you look at the Austrians there, and that was fantastic for me because I could also see that out of these 24,500 people, I found immediately 1,100 Austrian Jews amongst them who were later on deported and murdered. And if you look at them, this picture seems to be quite different. However, it is only different because you have to put it into proportion to the much larger number of Jews in general. If you do so, then this looks very similar already. So you can see that's exactly the same area. If anything, the Austrian Jews were even in a closer area here at that point. Unlike most of the deportees who were sent from Mechelen to Auschwitz, like also Istatenza's mother and the sisters, Istatenza survived Auschwitz and was liberated in Ravensbrück. I found this beautiful photo actually in our archive of her after the war in Belgium, leading a group of former resistance fighters. She also explains how this was leaving the siblings and the mother behind in the last note that she has, but she, however, survived the war and then worked also in the documentation center after the war. So my presentation just tried to give you an insight into possibilities for further future cooperation and research into this. I think it just opens a lot of questions where Austrians and Viennese people lived at that point and the similarities of the refugees and other people in Antwerp at that point. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Thank you for an interesting presentation. We immediately go on with the next speaker, Dorien Styven. She's an archivist and researcher at Kazerne Dossin Memorial Museum and Research Center on Holocaust and Human Rights, where she's responsible for its archives and database management. She also engages in research both in history and in digital humanities. So, Dorien, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Karin. I've started sharing my screen, I think.
Yes, you did.
Okay, great. Okay, so thank you for inviting me to talk today. I will tell you a bit more about an ongoing project. So the results are still preliminary, but we are trying to map the fate of families of the men that were claimed by Organisation Tot in the summer of 1942. Here is two very interesting pictures from a private collection that we received. They show men from Antwerp in labor camps in northern France. So between June and September 1942, over 2,250 men from Belgium were taken to these camps, which included Boulogne-sur-Mer, Damme, Camiers, Condat, and La Masure in the French Ardennes. So they were taken to work on what would become the Atlantic Wall later on. Why are these photos so interesting? The one on the top left is a photo of Vital Lieberman, who sent it in July 1943 to his cousins Anna and Rosa in Antwerp. So this photo is proof that there was communication possible between the men in these labor camps in France and the families that they left behind. And we specifically researched the families that were left behind in Antwerp. What was our research hypothesis? Well, we argued that because there was communication between these men who were fathers, husbands, and sons, and their families in Antwerp, that the families knew where they were, that they received news from them and small wages, that the families stayed put, that they stayed at their legal address, and that they were thus much more vulnerable towards arrest and deportation from Belgium to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And we also argue that by calculating the deportation rate of these families, that we can explain why the deportation rate for Antwerp is this much higher than other cities in Belgium because of this forced labor for Organisation Tot, because over 70% of all of these 2,250 men who worked for Organisation Tot came from Antwerp. So that's almost, that's over 2 out of 3 of the men that were Antwerpians. So in our research, we didn't really focus on the men and the camps in northern France, but we really focused on the families and what had happened to them. How did we research? First, we tried to establish what types of communication that there were possible between the camps in northern France and the families that were left behind. And groundbreaking work on this topic has been done by, for example, Andreu, Jean-Emile Andreu, as well as Daniel Dalmer, Rudy Rigaud. So there was a basis that we could leave from. So we mapped correspondence regarding wages. Some of the men received some money for the work that they did in northern France. We were also able to trace personal correspondence, letters back and forth between the camps, either official correspondence, which was censored, or clandestinely sent letters between the two. And in the Les Masures camp, that was in the Ardennes, so not at the actual coastline, which was restricted area, in Les Masures, even families were able to visit their men at the campsites. So there were families visiting them, and at some occasions, men from the camps were sent on leave back to Antwerp. So we can see that there's all types of communication that consorted the families and the men that they should stay at their legal addresses. To identify these types of communication, we use several source materials, including personal diaries. We have a very interesting diary of one of the men at Dan Camiers, Moses Sant, who describes all types of communication. We have personal letters, we have witness accounts, published memoirs of Joseph Peretz and others. Archives of the Jewish Council, who talk about parcel shipment, the payment of wages, women that come to the Bureau of the Jewish Council to see if there's news. So we have all these types of materials that we gathered to do micro research on these personal stories of the families from Antwerp. This is a very good example from the archives. These are postcards from Mathilde Kornitzer from Antwerp, who lives at Natunestraat. Her husband, Jacques Klapholz, was in the Le Mazur camp in the Ardennes. And this camp, the men at this camp were deported on the 24th of October 1942 to the Dossin barracks and then to Auschwitz-Birkenau, but the families didn't know. So Mathilde writes to her husband. The first sentence reads in Dutch that she is healthy and she's happy that she's still at home, so living at her legal address. It is at the point when this card that she sends to Jacques at La Mazur is returned to her with the written marking in blue. You can see it on the bottom right. Parti sans laisser d'adresse. So the man, Jacques, left without leaving an address. It is at this point that she goes into hiding, when she knows, okay, he's no longer there. So this is a clear indication of what this type of communication can do to the families. It can not only make them more vulnerable to deportation, but it can also warn them to go into hiding. So it works both ways, actually. So how do we measure the impact of this communication? And so how do we measure the deportation rate of the Antwerp families of OT laborers? Well, first of all, we needed to determine which of the 2,252 men that were taken from Belgium were actually from Antwerp, because that was not clear. There was a list of workers which we had to compare with addresses that were available in other sources. So based on, for example, municipal Jewish registers of 1940, immigration documents, forms filled out with the Association of Jews, we were able to determine that of the 2,252 men, 1,553 were actually from Antwerp. We analyzed their fates because these 1,553 were not all deported to Auschwitz. Some were killed in the labor camps in France, others escaped. And we divided them into these different groups because in the continuation of this project, we want to analyze if there is a difference between the fate of the families based on the fate of the men. For example, families that knew that their husbands were killed in France, they go into hiding more than the families of those that were sent to Auschwitz from France. So this is still upcoming research. So in the end, we selected 602 out of 1,553 of the Antwerpian OT workers, and we mapped their addresses in Antwerp. So we got an overview of these 602. And for these 602, we identified their relatives. And by relatives, we mean that we identified the persons that were blood relatives and that lived at the same address as they did in the summer of 1942. And that can be a very, for the Orthodox men, it can be a very large group of relatives. It can be parents, siblings, children, spouses, but also uncles, aunts, cousins, stepmothers, stepbrothers. So it's a very complex list of family ties. Once we identified them, we also had to trace their fate. So for over 1,360 relatives that we were able to identify, we then checked, were they deported? Were they in hiding? Do we know anything about their fate? And this led us to the conclusion that you can see the numbers here. So for the complete Jewish population in Belgium, it is estimated that 45 to 50% of all Jews were deported from the entire country. The number for Antwerp is 56%, so over half of the Antwerp population was deported. But for the relatives of OT workers, the deportation rate is almost 74%, which is much, much higher than the general number and the Antwerp number, which shows that the impact of OT is significant for this group. We also checked how many of the deportees survived the camps. So in general, the general number for Belgian deportees that left for the camps is 5.5% survivors. But for the OT families of all those deported, only 1.64% survived. mostly because the families that were left behind in Antwerp are wives with smaller children. So of course, when they were deported and arrived in Auschwitz-Birkenau, they did not stand a chance during selection. So we can see here that there is a large difference for the OT families, and that this background of being an OT family can explain a large percentage of the deportees from Antwerp. Here you can see, as Wolfgang also already indicated, two maps. So on the left, we have the 602 addresses in the summer of 1942 of all the families that were in the group that we selected. And on the right, you can see the remaining families, so those that survived in 1944 that were still there. But the dots don't represent the number of people. So it can be that from a family of 10, for example, only one survived. So the dot does not, we still need to do some visual work. So in conclusion, we've done a lot of statistical analysis. So now we want to broaden the research to ways in which the OT relatives were arrested. For example, were they more arrested during raids or taken individually? What were the actions taken by the women? Are there differences between the groups of OT men? We will do this by creating or writing 2 research papers and creating a public website to disperse the information. So we look forward to presenting more research results the upcoming contactdagen in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorien, again for a fascinating presentation. And we move on to the last speaker of this afternoon, Jan Maes. I don't have to introduce him because he already was introduced to us. So the floor is yours, Jan.
Okay, do you see my presentation? Hello, do you see my presentation? Okay, fine. Okay, I discovered a Jewish Jew hunter, and I will explain how I found it out. I already spoke about my first research on my book on these Orthodox Calvinists trying to convert these Jews. And this missionary, Bakker, in 1946, he writes, I visited Miss Helga Zweig in prison, who is accused from the Jewish side to have denounced her parents. It's a very complicated case. The girl is completely broken and is quite inconsolable. In addition, the prison management does not allow a quiet and confidential conversation, a very sad case. She reads the gospel given to her. Most of the people in Belgium, they know about Glogowski or Le Gros Jacques, who was he was a Jew, and he really worked together with the Sipo-SD in the Judenabteilung. He was a Vehman, a Vertrauensman, confident and informer of the Jewish section of the Sipo-SD in Brussels. He's the most known. He was allowed to carry a pistol, but he was not the only one. Barbara Dixon of the Fondation de la Mémoire Contemporaine, of the Stichting voor Eigentijdse, she said there were about 20 Jews working together with the Sipo-SD in Brussels. Maxim Steinberg had already mentioned her, but only with her initials. And he said, mais la jeune HZ, Helga Zweig, qui quant à elle fait arrêter ses parents pour son 18e anniversaire, est allemande, désormais danseuse, la jeune fille autorisée à porter une arme mène aussi la grande vie dans les boîtes de la capitale. In the footnote, he writes, ses parents sont inscrits à Malines le 8 janvier 1944 et déportés par le convoi 23 du 15 janvier. Auparavant, la jeune fille portant la fausse identité de Marion Dubois était cachée dans un couvent. Was not correct. She wasn't hidden in a convent. She was sentenced to death. She went into appeal, and in appeal, the sentence was changed into lifelong imprisonment. Most important contemporary sources I used were her criminal file, her files from the Punishment Enforcement Court, and the individual foreigners' files of herself and of her parents. This is her. She was born in 1925, so she was 18 years old in 1944. She was the only daughter of a German, rather wealthy industrial producer and sales representative of confection, sportswear, and rainwear, which is important because he was allowed to work when he fled to Belgium. He was allowed to work because it wasn't into competition with the Belgian workers or the Belgian industry. So her father fled in 1938, followed by his wife and the daughter. They came to Belgium. They had to go to the Netherlands back because their visa wasn't okay anymore. So then they came back to Belgium and he was allowed to work. They moved to a luxurious apartment. So they were rather wealthy people at the Avenue Huismans in Elsene. They were registered in the Register of the Jews, and specifically here is that it's written on these in this register, Juif ne pratique pas, or written with their religion, aucune. So they had no religion, they were completely secular. She went to the school Mes Enfants, completely secular, mixed school. She was expelled from the school because she threatened to denounce classmates to the Germans. And then she had to go to the Institut de Recollie until December 1941, because from that moment on, Jewish children were not allowed to go to other than Jewish schools anymore. She followed private lessons until the summer of 1942. From August 1942, they got false identity papers under the name of Dubois. They go into hiding in Ganshoorn, near to Brussels, with a pre-war business relation who had become a friend, Francois van Horenbeek and his wife. In December 1943, they had to move to another small house in Ganshoorn, and it was offered by Superintendent or Commissar of Police Roelkens. But she had a very, very bad relationship with her parents, in particular with the mother. She was this is what other people say about her at the trial after the war. She's a liar, she's a thief with a very difficult character, misbehaving, hypocritical, sly, unreliable, vicious, perverse, capable de tout pour avoir la liberté. She's a bad schoolgirl, so she doesn't study at the school of the Fille de la Sagesse in Ganshoorn. These are her parents. She's exposed as a truant, so she doesn't she doesn't go to class, but she says at home, I'm going to class during the vacation around Christmas, but she doesn't go. And so this turns out that, well, one of the head of the convent, she asked the mother what's happening, and the mother comes to the convent, and then she discovers that she didn't go to she went partying in Brussels. So Helga denounces her parents, who are arrested the next morning by the Veldgendarmerie. They were brought to the Zammerlager in the Dossin barracks in Mechelen, and they were deported with the 23rd convoy to Auschwitz-Birkenau, and they don't survive. Helga to Superintendent of Police Roelkens. And these are her words. Je voulais avoir ma liberté, et d'ailleurs, vous aurez vous-même des ennuis parce que vous m'avez caché mes parents. So she threatens Roelkens, who was hiding her and her parents. She said, yeah, I wanted to have my liberty. And I'm going to denounce you because you were hiding me and my parents. Her girlfriend, Denise Merveille, she says, elle nous a déclaré qu'elle s'était mise en service de la Gestapo, qui lui avait offert de la munir de revolver. Elle aurait refusé, nous disait-elle, mais qu'elle se sentait en sûreté parce qu'elle avait donné la liste de tous les gens, of all people, qu'elle connaissait, et que ces personnes seraient prises comme otages s'il devait lui arriver quelque chose. She had given all the Jewish names she knew. Helga to van Horenbeek, the other person who was hiding her and her family. Je vais dénoncer tous les Juifs que je connais. Il faut bien que je vive. D'ailleurs, vous aurez également de grands ennuis, ainsi que le commissaire Roelkens, parce que vous nous avez cachés, sachant que nous étions Juifs. So she said the same threat to van Horenbeek, saying, you were hiding us, you knew we were Jewish. So, and I gave all the names of all the Jews I knew to the Sipo-SD. Louise van Horenbeek, so the wife of Mr. van Horenbeek, elle m'a menacé, she threatened us, m'accusant de toutes les bontés que j'avais eues pour ses parents. I've done everything I could for these people, and she was denouncing us. She gathers all the furniture, paintings, clothes of her mother, books, objects of her parents, and sells them immediately. She tries to borrow as much money as she can, but she's a big spender. The amount of money she pays to her hairdresser, it's unbelievable. a week. Big spender continued always to be in debt, never refunding these loans, and the people were afraid to reclaim their money because she was a member of the Sipo-SD. This is her. And that's how she looked like in 1944 when she was partying already. According to her girlfriend Denise, elle était complètement transformée et paraissait très joyeuse. Maquillée et revêtue de plus belles robes de sa mère. Elle était richement habillée. La conduite de la prévenue est devenue de plus en plus légère. Elle menait la grande vie. So when she was partying, she had a lot of lovers. Elle était habillée comme une princesse et faisait des dépenses folles. She starts working at the Sipo-SD, Judenreferent Fritz Erdmann, as a seductive master spy with a false identity card and identity. She's on these false identity papers. It said that she's 21, but she's only 80 years old. As Marion Jacqueline Dubois, she denounces Jews, communists, members of the resistance, and men who refuse to do Arbeitsdienst in Germany. And she gets financial benefits and freedom in return for it. Sipo-SD member Edmund Handke says, je suis certain que la nommée Zweig a dénoncé bien d'autres juifs et que je sais parce que ces dénonciations étaient invoquées dans ces états de service qui devaient être adressés à Berlin. Il fallait en effet une autorisation spéciale de Berlin pour engager officiellement des juifs au service de la Gestapo. You have to know there are 20 people, 20 Jews working together with the Sipo-SD. Helga Zweig, in her testimony in 1944, it's the only time she admits that she worked at the Sipo-SD. Il est exact que j'étais engagée à la Gestapo en qualité de dénonciatrice, section juive, sous la direction du commissaire allemand Borchardt. She was really a femme fatale. She presented herself as an artist dancer, being a party girl with a nachtpassierschein, so she could stay outside during the night, infiltrate as an agent provocateur in artistic settings in bars, nightclubs, dancings. Helga to Smith van Horenbeek. Maintenant, il n'y a plus assez de juifs, je dois m'occuper des communistes. On m'a signalé des établissements où je pourrais en rencontrer. So now, not only Jews, now she's going for communists too. She went and dined regularly with members of the Sipo-SD and high-ranking German officers. She had several lovers, in only less than a year. Brussels is liberated in September 1944. She's arrested 3 times. She's released and then arrested again. She's denounced by other Belgian Sipo-SD collaborators and arrested because she betrayed them and then they betrayed her. Nearly all her testimonies are unworthy of belief. She invents a complete fictional story and explanation and denies every accusation.
Jan, I have to interrupt you 10 minutes.
Yeah, I'm closing. Yeah, to appeal compassion from the Catholic and Protestant prison chaplains, and this is my final slide. So she has a trial, a death penalty for denouncing people to the enemy. In appeal, it gets to long life imprisonment. She's a very difficult prisoner who continues to plot and using people to be released to acquire money, property, and preferential treatment. And with the help of these Protestants, she's released in 1951, thanks to the Wet Lejeune. She's put over the border. She goes to Heidelberg, and in Heidelberg, then she goes to Berlin. And probably it's still possible that she's still alive, but we don't know. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Jan. Time for questions.